So it's good to be here, first of all. And what I want to sort of echo is this sort of sense of collapse. Austerity, in my estimation, is probably the single most insidious domestic policy presently because it effectively hollows out public institutions. And one has to ask, for whom? And as Ivy pointed out, for people of color who are poor, largely in urban areas, but really also in rural and suburban. We might want to ask for whom, is there another way? And I want to get to that at the end. Some part of what I want to speak to, the largest part, is going to be about public higher education. But much of what you'll hear about public higher education is going to reverberate, because much of what I'll say about higher education was preceded by many years in public education and, frankly, in public health. So we have a long, long history regarding austerity. And ultimately what austerity is about, and I think we have to really go back to 1980 when Ronald Reagan rewrote the tax codes, the federal tax codes. Those tax codes were rewritten, and fundamentally those tax codes drove a federal deficit as they were rewritten. That deficit became a way of redistributing money, frankly, upward, and at the same time became a rationale for policies of austerity. And the real trickle-down theory was that austerity formula trickled from the federal government to state governments to city. I would like to say that this could be solved without a substantial redistributive investment of taxes, but it can't be. This is going to require substantial effort in raising new dollars to be invested in public institutions across the country. And the question is, how? I mean, here we are. We're faced with Trump. I'm going to get to that at the very end of this as well, because the American electorate actually has been very clear in polling about its predilection for investment in a cross-section of public services, but the Democratic Party has really not caught up with that polling to have bold new agendas in relationship to that polling. We've got to take a look at that in a relationship to the Democratic Party in this moment. This is about class and race. And when we think about austerity, I think it's very, very important as the elections were yesterday, as a signal to Donald Trump, we have to understand that austerity is a bipartisan partnership across this country. It began with Reagan. It deaccelerated, but continued under Carter, and we can go right on down the line. We are going to need another agenda in the Democratic Party, because we're sure as heck not going to find it in the Republican Party, to counterpose to the present austerity agenda. When we ask what is austerity, in one sentence, it monetizes and privatizes, in turn shrinking public services. Right? Because as you're monetizing, and I'm going to speak more concretely about this in a moment, in monetizing and privatizing, you're moving money out, and it shrinks it. Once you shrink services, education, higher ed, then you got to ration it, because you can't. You're being asked to do more with less, but you've got to also ration it. Once you begin to ration it, you've got to redefine the very nature of the public service. One might ask about testing. Testing redefines curriculum. As it redefines curriculum, it often produces cheaper curriculum. As we move online in starved public institutions, the first place in public higher education where it's being introduced is in community colleges. Every study indicates that community college students are least apt to benefit from online learning because it's the relationships with instructors embodied that move their education forward. But it's a cheaper form of education for an already cheap form of public higher education. In higher education, there's been a privatization and outsourcing to private vendors like Google, Goldman Sachs, Udacity, in which, frankly, higher education is increasingly seen as an investment. It's a place to make money. The most concrete example of that are for-profit colleges, but there are many other examples because it's not only the site of the delivery of the service, it's also about the technology, the tools that get put in place. They're academic products developed for mass market, long-term market, and other forms of learning, and that reinvent public higher education. Public higher education, frankly, is the only public good that can be globalized easily, right? It's a real fit with a globalized economy. And the reason is you take online learning at NYU and you transmit it to Dubai. You transmit it to China. You transmit it to any part of the world in packages. And in fact, that's occurring. And as you globalize it, you also have a capacity to further monetize it. And some of these forces are already beginning to converge in a relationship. Now, this has a particular implication for public higher education, a sphere which has been starved just like K through 12 public education. Both have had that experience. And so when we look at the question of the starvation of public services, public higher education is competing against institutions that are already equipped to globalize, to bring, for example, money in through some of these ventures. That has consequence for public higher education being able to continue to compete. In New York State, the dollars for public higher education were cut by 18% in full-time equivalent students since 2008. That's chicken feed as contrasted to the University of Chicago Circle, which experienced a 47% decline in public funding in a 3-year period. That's austerity, right? But by the way, in New York State, it was with a Democratic governor. So we're looking at, as well, Davos, the most recent Davos conferences. Higher education was seen as a most potentially profitable area in the future, and folks looking at higher education as a place to begin to invest various money. There's the marketing of colleges and so on by their rankings worldwide, and it's one of the few American areas left that are internationally competitive. 45 out of the top 100 colleges or universities globally are American universities, so they're quite competitive globally. I would argue that higher education is increasingly an engine of inequality. That's a pretty provocative statement because we've always seen public higher education or higher education as an engine of equality, and the Raj Chetty study out of Stanford indicates that, for example, CUNY, the City University of New York, moved as many young people into the middle class who were poor as every Ivy League college, MIT, University of Chicago, Stanford combined. Of course, they start with a very low base, right? Each of those colleges, relatively speaking. Why do I say it's an engine of inequality? Let me cite the ways. There's a dilution of full-time equivalent investment, right? That has been reduced, and the place where the full-time equivalent investments in students, as the census of students grow and public dollars diminish, the FTE goes down. Our community colleges have the lowest FTE. State colleges, like the state college system in California, is the second, or comprehensive colleges in the CUNY system, and it's the elite flagships that have the highest. The greatest concentration of poor students and students of color are in community colleges and the state university systems. So that's unequal. Pell adds to that. I don't have the time to go. We can deal with that later. Tuition increases in inequality. The cost of attending a public college inched up for well, actually more than inched. It went up substantially between 1971 and 2011. For the top fifth of the rich, relative middle class to the wealthy, the percentage of family income dedicated to higher education went from 6 to 9%. For the poorest fifth, the part of the family income dedicated to higher education went from 42% to 114%. That's unequal. The proportion of full-time students who were employed, the 34% were employed in 1970, 50% by the year 2000. Those who work over 20 hours That's a really more or less beginning to approximate a full-time job. And the question is how you juggle the academics and the work. 15% in 1970 worked 20 hours. By 2000, that number had doubled. Race and class gaps on college completion. Bailey and Donarski. 30 years ago, there was a 31% difference between the share of poor and prosperous Americans earning a bachelor's degree. That gap. Today, there's a 45%. Student debt, and this is the most, and frankly, probably the most dramatic statistic. 25% of the population based on net worth who have a net value, net worth, less than $8,500, accumulated 58% of student debt. Alternatively, the top 25%, that is between $311,000 and $983, accumulated 6%. Up and down, there's an inequality. An inequality in terms of debt, an inequality in terms of full-time equivalent investment, an inequality because of the over-reliance in public universities on part-time faculty, on the availability of faculty, because it's been hollowed out. That inequality is also evident, frankly, in public education. We don't see the same conditions in more affluent communities. We don't see the same conditions even in relatively in middle class or upper middle class communities. People don't allow their school systems to make those choices. Those are the choices increasingly that are being made for those students in higher education least able to afford a college education. And this is happening, and I'm going to end here. This is happening at the same time that the numbers of students of color are coming into public higher education in greater and greater numbers. The cohort of white students within college-age adult population declined between 1990 and 2010 from 71.7 to 57.2. That was made up by students of color coming into those systems at precisely the moment that we're experiencing much of this disinvestment. It is impossible, and I'm not saying people are not sitting around trying to hatch a plot against poor and students of color, but the dynamics are such that this is a story that is fundamentally about race and class in a relationship to public institutions and the ways not only that there's a disinvestment, but the access on the basis of tuition on the one hand and debt and the quality of the education that can be offered as institutions struggle to provide any version of quality, and particularly as compared to private universities.
Thank you, Mike.